Order, order. Welcome to the Health and Social Care Select Committee hearing. This is a one-off hearing on gambling harms. So we have in front of us two panels of witnesses who will be introduced as they come on. And the purpose of today's session is to look at the wider gambling landscape, the public health response to gambling-related harms, and indeed what the government and related bodies can do about it. So in the first session, may I start by asking our witnesses to introduce themselves and what they do, starting with Professor Wardle, please.
Hi, I'm Professor Heather Wardle. I'm a Professor of Gambling Research and Policy based at the University of Glasgow, and I was co-chair of the Lancet Public Health Commission on Gambling, which was published last year, which looked at what a public health response to gambling might look like and made international recommendations. I have some copies of that with me if anybody would like any at the end.
Thank you. Mr. Chamberlain?
Hi, I'm Sam Chamberlain. I'm Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Southampton. My research work has been ranked in the top 10 globally in terms of the field of gambling. And clinically, I work in the NHS as well, and I founded and direct the NHS Southern Gambling Treatment Service. And just to finish, I don't have any conflicts in relation to the gambling industry or their linked organisations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Lucy?
Hello, I'm Lucy Harbour. I'm the Director of Public Health for Nottingham, and I'm representing the Association of Directors of Public Health.
Thank you so much, all three of you. So first question from me, perhaps to our eminent professors. So gambling products have changed quite a lot since the Gambling Act in 2005. I wonder if we could start by you just giving us a sense of what does the landscape look like now, perhaps starting with you, Professor Wardle.
Sure. I mean, so since the Gambling Act in 2005, what we've seen is obviously the massive growth of online gambling, the intensification of products, the fact that they are available through smartphones 24/7. The speed and the intensity of the products have sharpened, and previous products, for example, like sports betting, which were essentially one-off events, have now transformed into those continuous formats through the in-play betting, for example. So you have a fundamentally different landscape in terms of access availability, but also the nature of the products in terms of their speed, their intensity, how engaging they are, how able they are to capture people's attention. And that's a fundamental change in the online environment. Equally, we also see changes in the offline environment. The land-based machines themselves have adopted some of those practices. So on the B3 machines, the games are much more intensive than they have been previously, and now much more focused on the kind of casino-style products than we saw previously.
Thank you. Professor Chamberlain, do you have anything to add?
Yes, well, I agree with Professor Wardle. I'd also highlight clinically we often see our patients are reporting online gambling as being a problem because these products are they're so intrusive. They could be sending people messages in the middle of the night with free bets, free money. So I think over time there's this tendency towards more addictive products in general, and I think also that the industry is well ahead of independent academics in terms of knowing and maybe understanding what makes those products so addictive. Mm-hmm. We've seen some shifts. I think the shift towards online means there's fewer bars to developing gambling problems, whereas previously you would have had to physically go to a casino, for example. Now you can be doing it in bed at night. It's not good.
In terms of so you started touching on the risks. So we've got an addictive product which is now available in your bedroom. Is there any other risks that we should be aware of for the new landscape as well?
Well, I suppose, I don't know, would it be helpful for me to give a very brief overview of how the gambling-related harms can just impact people?
Yes.
So I'll keep this concise because it's very complicated. In terms of the terminology, we've got gambling disorder, which is the clinically recognised condition, but actually, as Professor Ward and others have highlighted in their research work, it's a spectrum of harms. So we see in clinic people with the more severe end of the harms. But broadly speaking, gambling disorder and gambling harms affect people in different ways. On a personal level, it can lead to suicide, anxiety, depression, other addictions. In terms of families, it leads to relationship breakdowns. It's devastating. In terms of academic and employment, it's strongly linked to worse academic outcomes, academic dropout, unemployment, and then more broadly, homelessness as well, strong links with homelessness. We've got the knock-on impact as well that's worth bearing in mind in terms of other services. So if someone's becoming homeless due to gambling-related issues, then there's charities that have to try to help that person. That has a knock-on impact. If people are presenting in suicidal crisis, that impacts our paramedics and frontline services. So these are some of the broad themes of harms. But they're wider than that, of course, because for each person affected by gambling-related harms, that's likely to have a knock-on impact for other family members and other aspects of society as well.
And just to add, you asked about categories of risk. It's also about the way that the commercial industry now operates. So particularly with the move to online, they now capture a wide range of data on every single bet behaviours. They're able to model that, they're able to profile you, they're able to target you and use that information, and they do use that information to send bonus offers, to keep you engaged and to keep you re-engaged. And in fact, there was a really pertinent statistic that was cited in the white paper that amongst people who had the highest levels of harms, they reported receiving daily incentives. 34% of them reported receiving daily incentives to gamble. Yet those who didn't experience any harms, only 4% reported getting the same amount. So it shows you how that targeting and profiling is happening, and there is a much wider ecosystem now of the commercial gambling industry, which extends into broadcasters, into advertisers, into financial institutions that are all interested in making the commercial gambling industry to be viable and continue to be viable.
Can I ask you actually about advertising? I mean, one of the reflections I had before this session was you turn on the radio and you watch television and it's all, it's not all gambling adverts, but it does seem to be pretty prolific and it seems to have gone greater over time. I mean, have we quantified how much advertising has been going on in this space? And also what's now the proportion between the offline and the online? So the television and radio versus, the online incentives that get pushed to people.
The latest statistics that I'm aware of on that were looking at the paid-for advertising in 2021, in one quarter of 2021, and that amounted to £91 million for one quarter. So you could see over the course of a year how much is being invested in for paid-for advertising, so that's your TV or your radio and so on. That doesn't take into account all the streams of advertising that you have, the social media advertising, the online advertising as well. In respect, I don't have data, I'm afraid, on the split between online and land-based, but we certainly know that there is a great push, particularly for the online mechanisms.
Yeah, Lucy, would you like to comment?
I think the really pertinent question here is how does that advertising reach people? And the Gambling Commission themselves note that about 80% of the population are exposed on a weekly basis to some form of advertising. And what we know is that we are seeing this advertising reaching children and young people and normalising gambling at that early age with young people.
We're going to come back specifically to this point later on.
Great.
But the 80% refers to children and adults together, is that correct?
It's the population, whether it's TV adverts or whether it's sponsorship or whether it's online adverts. But as you said, it's now almost impossible to access media of some form without being exposed. And we know that exposure leads to behaviour change. It leads to prompting people to take action with really clear evidence back on children and young people about the influence that it has on them.
Yes, go ahead. I was also going to ask a little bit about the sort of the pipeline, so the gambler pipeline. So, you might start by looking at an advert and, perhaps dabbling with a single bet, and just to ask about, can you take us on a journey of someone who perhaps started gambling because of an advert, but then ended up in your clinic? That was something I was quite interested in hearing from you. But first, if you want to comment on the previous bit, that would be great. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. As well as the statistics, I think personally we probably all see it as well. I don't know about you, but since the lockdown previously and then onwards, just pervasive adverts about gambling on television all the time, promoting very happy messaging. It's very sociable, even for games that involve no social contact. And the other worrying thing is, there's sort of the sports. I know we're going to cover young people later on, but they're saying this all the time. They're seeing these adverts on television. They're seeing the football team promoting gambling adverts in the matches during daytime. So it's just extremely intrusive. So in terms of the pipeline, obviously it varies depending on the person. Generally speaking, I would be of the view that there's no completely benign form of gambling. Like there will be one or two people for all types of gambling in every 100 who develop an addiction because of it, generally speaking. Although, of course, some products we know are a lot more harmful than others. But even lotteries in the round aren't benign. They'd be linked to 1 to 2% of people developing a gambling disorder based on international data. And yes, often we do see a progression clinically. So someone might start with the less addictive form of gambling, but that can act as a kind of gateway, because often the venues and the physical venues, be it the bookies or websites like the National Lottery website, it's advertising, yes, normal gambling, lotteries, but scratch cards, which is a more addictive product. So there are gateways there. Of course, some people are able to gamble and don't develop a problem. They don't progress to addiction. And we need a lot more research to understand the protective and vulnerability factors behind that. We know a bit about that already, and maybe we'll come to those later.
Yeah, we're going to come to those. Right, Josh Fenton-Glynn.
Thank you. I think the interesting thing about the advertising is it just normalises gambling so much, and you kind of, I think I listen to a lot of sports podcasts, so I come across it quite a lot, and you can kind of see the pervasive nature. So obviously the government are introducing the Prevention Commissioner and kind of looking a bit more at the public health side of this. Do you think we're shifting to getting the balance right between kind of helping individuals and public health? I'm probably going to start with Lucy for that one.
Thank you. And if the committee will indulge me, it's probably just worth us understanding when we talk about a public health approach, what do we actually mean by that? And the difference, I think, with the public health approach is we're interested in populations. And as you rightly say, so much of the focus has been about treating individuals, about those people at that top of that pyramid. And at that point, we've kind of already experiencing significant harm along that spectrum of harm. So taking a population-based approach, we need to understand what the need is for the population. We need to understand the drivers of that behaviour. We need to understand those populations that are at greatest risk of harm, and I do mean risk of harm. And then we need to understand the evidence of what works. So that's kind of the principles of taking a public health approach. And I think there is a significant shift in that, which is moving away from this focus of treating individuals that the industry are telling us have got problem gambling behaviour, to understanding that this is an addictive and increasingly normalised behaviour which is causing a lot of harm. And it's worth noting that those public health harms are not the same as healthcare harms. So the stuff that Professor Chamberlain will see in his practice, actually we won't see the family breakdown, we won't see the homelessness that are impacting in those services. It'll be a consequence of. So there's significant harm that's hidden. And I think we need to make sure that we understand that prevention itself is not enough, that telling people that gambling is harmful, we need to support that with properly funded and supported regulatory activities, both nationally and locally. There's lots of work going on at local authorities led by directors of public health, trying to challenge licensing. Something the committee might wish to consider is that there's currently a statutory duty to permit betting premises, which feels a little bit as if it works against the public health harm. Directors of public health are not a responsible authority on planning licensing applications for gambling, so we have to work twice as hard to be able to influence that. And we know that the industry will always appeal a decision to overturn a licensing, so we have to work twice as hard on that as well. So there's lots that we can do locally around changing that sort of licensing, creating the environment differently. I also think that there's quite a lot that we can do to make sure that the policies that are already in place are enforced. So we've got, tremendous resources in trading standards officers locally. Additional resource there, we could make sure that the land-based activities are being supported as we see. We're seeing increasing numbers of children and young people. I know we want to come back to children and young people, but we're seeing increasing numbers of children and young people using land-based. We can't assume that they're just, gaming, that they are physically gambling as well. And we need to think about how we issue some of those counter messages about how we upskill the workforce to be able to do some of that routine inquiry work, but also how we begin to challenge, using the industry's own tactics, how we begin to challenge some of that normalisation around gambling.
Just pick up on a little bit of that. So obviously one thing about public health is about recognising patterns in populations. Possibly to Professor Wardle, but my suspicion is that people have the best idea of the pattern of the pipeline from placing a few bets to ending up, placing a bet on your phone in the middle of the night. So the people that hold that data, so the gambling companies. Do you think that, I suspect the answer is yes, but what more do you think they could be doing to identify that pipeline?
So I'm not sure it's what more the industry could be doing. It's what more could we have in terms of independent research and oversight of those processes and systems. So you asked, were we moving towards a better system in terms of regulation? We rely heavily on the industry to provide solutions to these issues. We rely on the industry to identify those people with whom interactions should be made, and they trust the industry to make those interactions. Now, we've seen systemic failures in that by the regulator and the fines that they've issued. We are also relying on the industry to implement their own voluntary codes for advertising and marketing and assume that they stick to them. They are frequently breached, and you may put in complaints to the ASA about that, and the response is, we can't, it's a breach of a voluntary code, we don't have any authority over that.
So on that, do you think that when the fun stop type adverts touch the sides?
No, absolutely not. And there's also research evidence that shows that they have very limited efficacy and actually in some cases might be counterproductive. But I do think what we need to be thinking about with the opportunity that we have with the levy is being really systematic about changing the monitoring and surveillance system that we have and making sure we get that independence into the prevention system. So we're not relying on an industry who are doing their fiduciary duty, they're generating profits, but they generate the profits from the people who are most harmed, and relying on them to actually implement the solutions. That system needs to change.
Sorry, Sam. Mr. Chamberlain.
Either's fine. So I really welcome the shift towards the public health approach. Just to expand a little bit on some of those thoughts. I mean, what we've seen for decades is a lot of research conducted with funds from voluntary donations from the gambling industry that's been of very poor quality. And we know from research work, for example, from Marion and colleagues, that stakeholders can set out with really positive intentions. So if you look at some of the experiences in Italy and Finland with regulating electronic gambling machines, good intentions, then industry lobbying, it gets watered down. Some changes are implemented from a public health point of view, but there was evidence from the research they were ineffective. And we see that in sort of review papers as well in the field, that generally if the public health interventions are funded through voluntary donations and influenced by the industry, the ones that would get promoted are those least likely to be effective in terms of reducing harms. And this is a real opportunity we have here with the levy, provided the funds are administered in a ring-fence protected way from conflicts of interest in industry, to really make a difference and do some good quality research and roll out public health interventions that actually help.
Can I just ask a slightly broader question, and I'm sorry to colleagues, I've gone entirely off my list of questions, but so looking at, I think particularly the electronic gambling seems to be a particular problem area. Could I ask, are there any places where there are interventions that work on those kind of gamblings and that kind of gambling at a public health level? So are there any countries that get it right?
There's lots of examples of different countries with different implementation, which actually fare far better. So, for example, there are mandatory deposit limits in countries like Norway, Spain, and a handful of others. And they actually limit how much people can actually lose within a period of time. And particularly in Norway, that has proved to be quite effective as part of a suite of measures in handling rates of problematic gambling. I don't think we can look at one country and say this country is doing it perfectly. There are lots of different countries who are doing some things really well, but we do have much better evidence for the efficacy of those kind of mandatory pre-commitments of those deposit limits in terms of being effective.
Yeah, it just feels to me like the marketing teams are masters at identifying people susceptible, but they're not doing the right thing. Sorry, Lucy.
I think that's a really critical point. And when we work with people with lived experience, one of the things that they tell us, and we hear a lot, is it feels like there is no escape. And they can't find a space. So either they are contacted, as Heather said earlier, just constantly bombarded with, we haven't seen you for a while, where are you, have some free bets, or they turn on the television, etc. So what we know is that the gambling companies really concentrate in areas of greater deprivation. We see, massive density of gambling-related products in those areas of people who are experience the greatest harm from it, and therefore you can't walk down your high street without gambling shop. And they do that because of the concentration of the land-based gambling machines. So there's the actions that we can take, but we can also do something just about that constant exposure that our population, and we know that less exposure, less behaviour.
I think that phrase is going to stick with me. There is no escape.
Yes.
I'll hand back to the chair.
Thank you very much. That was very powerful. Just very quickly, if I can come to Andrew George for an intervention, and then Paula Hamilton.
Thank you very much. Yes. So I just wanted to take you back, if you like, to a more broad brush, and indeed perhaps an ultra naive question. So this isn't even going out to the kind of helicopter view. It's possibly satellite level, and it's really what the sort of where this sits in terms of the range of comparative addictions that exist, and I suppose this is one for you, Sam. I guess from your perspective, I mean, why is it, or why should we give particular attention to the addiction of gambling as against sort of drugs and alcohol and sex and pornography and chocolate or any other range of addictions? I mean, other than the financial consequences, what should drive us into looking at this particular addiction more so than others?
Good question. So my response would be, we know that certain substances like alcohol and others have addictive propensity for some people, and partly that's because of their biological effects on the brain's reward pathways. So they kind of hijack those pathways that we've got anyway, which can lead to addiction, is one kind of biological way of trying to understand this. In terms of the behaviours, there are certain types of behaviours that people can get stuck undertaking repeatedly where they struggle to stop. But of all those behaviours, gambling is the one that's got the most evidence of being a sort of recognised medical condition. So we see case reports of gambling addiction basically dating back to ancient times. This isn't anything new for us. Gambling disorder is recognised in both of the international classification systems used by mental health professionals. So it's already widely accepted and fairly widely studied in that sense. As to whether we should be thinking about other types of behavioural addiction, we need a lot more research into that. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but it is relevant. But one issue is the internet and the role that plays in feeding different types of problematic behaviours, including gambling. So the World Health Organization now is starting to recognise other potential behavioural addictions like gaming disorder. So that's been listed as a disorder, whereas the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the other main system that we use, so that's not yet recognising gaming disorder as a full condition, but it has listed it as something that needs more study. So I think gambling disorder is a place to start because of the very high levels of harms that it's associated with, but also because it's been widely accepted as a mental health condition.
We need to move on to other questions, but if you weave in later on answers, that'd be great. Paula Hamilton.
Right, thank you, and thank you for coming this morning. My first question, what I wanted to do, I read some information that said that Greater Manchester Combined Authority, in its Gambling Arms Strategic Needs Assessment, found that people living in the most deprived areas are likely to participate in gambling. Now, we know that people from different groups, such as young people, such as men, people who have other addictions, they are most likely to take part in areas. The area I'm an MP in, it's terrible. We have 10 shops on one street that deal with gambling of one type or another. The planning just seems to be unable to stop them from opening, and even when planning says no, they appeal higher and seem to get what they want, even with all this evidence. So my question to you guys are, and I'd like all three of you to be quite succinct but to answer, how can OPID and the NHS ensure that their prevention and treatment interventions appropriately address the existing health inequalities? And if we start with you, Professor Wardle.
Sure. I mean, I do believe it is particularly about giving more powers to local authorities and addressing the systemic power imbalances that exist between the local authorities and the gambling industry. So I have been an expert witness on at least 2 cases for local authorities where they have been attempting to resist opening of a new gambling venue, and in each time, essentially, they run out of resources because they don't have the money to be able to take this and fight it to the magistrate courts to be able to to fight for pay the legal costs, and in the end they end up settling and putting conditions on the licence. The gambling operators don't have those kind of restrictions on them. It is fundamentally a power imbalance between the local authority and the operator, and the way the legislation is currently framed is not supporting them. Now, I do welcome that there were comments around cumulative impact assessments in the white paper, but it isn't clear how they will be operationalised, so it's very much waiting and seeing. But absolutely, the things that you have spoken about, we know there is strong evidence that shows there is disproportionate access and availability of land-based gambling opportunities, particularly electronic gaming machines in areas of greatest deprivation. We see that the gambling industry is making a disproportionate amount of its money from those who are in the most deprived areas. It is systematic and it needs addressing.
Thank you. Professor Wardle has covered local authorities well, so I just say I agree with that. I think clinically we need to be making sure that our services have extensive outreach for marginalised communities that might traditionally be hard to engage in both clinical practice and research, and one good way of doing that is to involve people with lived experience in the clinics. So for example, in our clinic we have a peer support worker who can help us with reaching out to those sort of marginalised communities. But of course it's an ongoing process of trying to engage with different groups. I think
the point I'd like you to come to is we're looking at prevention. We're talking about prevention. I think you've covered it well. But there's also treatment interventions. How can we appropriately address the existing health inequalities through treatment interventions?
Yes, I suppose focusing on treatments for gambling disorder, it's about making sure people are aware of the services that are available, because every part of England now has, a treatment service that can see people fairly quickly, providing evidence-based treatments. So that's the clinical side, is making sure people are aware those services exist and reducing barriers of access, which is something we've been working very hard on as a service, and I know others have as well. And I think the other thing we need to really bear in mind is that a lot of the clinical trials and research studies that are conducted often exclude particular marginalised communities. So from a research point of view, when we're doing those studies, we need for the funders to insist, whatever funding mechanisms ultimately arise, they need to insist that there's due consideration to making sure that there's diverse participation of communities in research.
Right, thanks. And I'm going to stretch you a little bit. So, how is this actually meeting the needs of local communities, what has been said? Because I don't think it is, so you can prove me wrong. And also, something that I think is really important, what lessons are being learned. So we know what's happening in local authorities, in local communities. We've talked about what is happening clinically, but how are we meeting and addressing the needs? Or the lessons, sorry.
I think they're really, really important questions, because there's been such a concentration on getting good treatment, and it's fantastic that we now, as Professor Chamberlain has said, we've now rolled out nationally this very medical model for those people who got a formal disorder. The next thing has to be that we move slightly away from that medical model and understand that we need a more socially based recovery model for people who aren't at that tipping point of disorder. And that's where we really need to bring in some of that cultural competence. Now, we have to understand that gambling and the harms from gambling are one of the most hidden forms of addiction, because we now all recognise that smoking is addictive. People, own their addiction to smoking. We're increasingly understanding the impacts of alcohol. And this is why, coming back to your question, this is the next one. So it's not the question of why this, it's the question of why not this. And one of the reasons is that this is one of the least understood areas. And local authorities have really been leading the way in terms of understanding the lived experience of people, understanding those barriers to coming forward, understanding the stigma that's attached to this. So much of our services are geared up around the bulk of users who are white men, under the age of 45. actually what we're seeing is huge impact. Children and young people, people from Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities where the stigma is greater, and also increasingly in women. So we need to make sure that we've got services that are suitable for both genders. And a lot of that is being driven through, you identified the Greater Manchester work, a large number of areas, including Nottingham, are leading the way with doing health needs assessments and then developing local strategies. What we haven't got is a good independent research system that is pulling the learning from that. So there's lots of local learning. There's increasing networks where people are sharing the good practice and learning. But what I'm really hoping is with the levy and its requirement around research is we will be focusing some of that activity in understanding not just interventions that work well, but how we organise ourselves and how we regulate. And we have to make sure that both the treatment and the research is independent of the industry so that we're getting truly objective and reliable information to support that. So it's you've got to a really important nub of a question, which is we still don't quite know all the stuff we don't know, but we're learning it. But it's in piecemeal, it's not part of a systematic nationwide approach.
Brilliant. Now, my next question is, I think it's a good one. So it's about, we know that ethnic minority groups are at high risk. We know that neurodiversity groups, they also have problems with the research that's going on and the fact that they're not identified enough. So the second question that I've got is, what other areas do you believe are under-researched, which you started to talk about, and should be prioritised? And then from each of you, and I'm just going to ask this to Professor Chamberlain and to Professor Wardle, and then to each of you, which area in the country, if you were to give us one area where you think there's I've identified Manchester because it seems to be doing really well. Which area, each one of you, give me an area that you think is absolutely doing a great job at the moment. So let's start with yourself, Professor Wardle.
Right, I'll start with the areas because you have the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. You also have the Yorkshire and the Humber ADH. I'm going to get the acronym wrong, but the Association for Directors of Public Health. And then you also have a similar consortium open in the North East. Now, they are all doing brilliant work and leading the way in providing resources to support other areas. The common factor that underpins the work of those areas is the resources that they have been able to get access to. So between each one of them has had somewhere in the region of £800,000 investment to be able to lead that work. And this is where, with the statutory levy, we absolutely need to be thinking about what the processes and the systems are to support other regions to be able to follow and implement that kind of excellent work. That's the thinking that I know other people will be doing, and I'm hoping that strategy will flow through with the levy implementation. In terms of underserved research areas, I mean, there are numerous areas in which we could all do more work. However, I would like to take a bit of a step back and talk a bit more actually about the monitoring and surveillance systems that we have in this country, because we have such limited insight on the range and extent of harms that people experience. And if you look at comparative areas, for example, drugs, they have really sophisticated surveillance systems that are standardised actually with principles and protocols across Europe. They have direct and indirect measurement of harms. In gambling, we have two surveys that people argue over, and we don't have a nationalised monitoring system for harms. We're not implementing, we don't understand how many people who are interacting with the criminal justice system are experiencing harms, how many people who are interacting with the NHS experience harms. We don't have that infrastructure available to us. Now, again, with the levy, there is an opportunity to develop that, and I absolutely think that's where we need to be investing some of our resources, because once you have that infrastructure, you then have the insight, it then enables you, it provides the bedrock of excellent research to be able to go forward.
Thank you. Professor Chamberlain?
Thank you, yes.
I don't have to repeat what's been said, but if you've got anything to add.
Understood. Yeah, I've nothing further to add in terms of the areas that are doing great work, but I think all the areas have got a lot of scope for improvement, you know. But in terms of key kind of research areas for the future, I'll just briefly highlight a few areas that I think would be important. One is longitudinal research to understand why some people are more vulnerable to gambling-related harms and how those harms change over time, because that could identify new intervention targets, and we don't have such a good study longitudinally based in the UK yet. Another would be public education campaigns and research into that so that they can be evidence-based and independent from the industry. Training curricula for professionals from public health and healthcare backgrounds to raise awareness and so that people can be helped when clients are identified who might benefit from early support. Controlled trials of interventions. And lastly, something like a register. So, for example, we have a really good example of the multiple sclerosis register, where people who have experience of multiple sclerosis can take part in research and they're kind of followed over time. It's a very sort of positive citizen science approach. I'd love to see that for gambling behaviours in the round, where people can join a register, contribute data over time at very large, unprecedented scale. And again, that would contribute towards identifying why some people are more vulnerable and what we can do about it. Thank you.
I am going to hand back to the chair, but did you have anything to add, or are you happy with what your colleagues have said?
I think colleagues have outlined things excellently.
Fantastic. I will hand back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Jen Croft.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to turn now to the impact on children and young people. Lucy, you've mentioned children gambling several times. First of all, I'm interested about the kind of ages that this encompasses. Is it just those under 18, or are we seeing younger and younger people getting involved? I know there are some safeguards in place, but of course people can find ways around those, particularly in the age we live in. And I note as well that Professor Wardle, you have previously noted that evidence around adolescent gambling behaviours is incomplete and probably outdated. I wonder if you can just speak to the kind of ways that young people gamble, and if potentially if that falls within the 10% of the industry that isn't covered by their own internal regulator.
Sure. So one of my areas of work was looking at the intersection between gambling and gaming, and how you have more gambling mechanics that are embedded within video games, which then it's part of that normalisation. So you are training this generation that this is the kind of risk that you take, this is the kind of reward that you might get, and embedding it with no age restrictions into things that are freely available to them. And there's been a lot of focus on loot boxes that people, and I know that's been discussed in Parliament before.
We're going to come back to loot boxes specifically later.
Yeah.
But in terms of what's the youngest that we're aware of?
Oh, I mean, I've interviewed children who have been engaging in these kinds of products from younger than 11, particularly with the ones that are embedded within the video games, because if you play that game, it's part of the feature. And we've seen them in games like Fortnite and so on. And then you also, let's not forget, we are one of the few jurisdictions in the whole world that legally allows our children to gamble on electronic gambling machines. There is no age restrictions for these Category D machines. Now, I know in the white paper there was talk of, when parliamentary time allows, closing down some of those restrictions. But of course, that means you get children who are very young engaging in certain forms of gambling.
And is it? Do you think it's creating a generation of people who are hooked on this behaviour in the way that, for example, the gaming industry and interacts and operates? I think, Lucy, you've spoken a lot about children gambling. So
yeah, I think again, I'm just going to bring us back to, it doesn't necessarily have to tip into a disorder. What we are seeing is that this massive change in the normalisation of gambling, that we gamble on everything and that we gamble in. So it used to be that you as was said earlier, you would go to a casino or you'd put a bet on for a horse race. You can now bet through a game. So just that continuous gambling is part of everything in life. And what we know is that we are doing something to protect children in the real world that actually really unprotected online. And the evidence around it's the online adverts that really motivate and prompt a behaviour change in children and young people. So what we're doing is creating habits early on, And we don't yet have the evidence, as Professor Chamberlain said, we need that study that looks in the long term around what this is going to have as an impact. But it is reasonable. We know from smoking, and we know from drinking, and we know from dietary habits that those behaviours formed young just increase and exacerbate through age. And so it is a sensible assumption to make that we are beginning to create problems of future generations where we will see increasing levels of harm amongst those generations. And I think it's really important to recognise that harm really impacts across the life chances. It impacts on their ability to complete their education, to hold and support a job, to maintain a family, to keep a roof over their head. You know, this is harm greater than more diverse and diffuse than we see in almost any of the other addictions, in that it really does go into every quarter of somebody's life. So I'm very concerned by the at the moment poorly understood impact that we're having, but what we do know is we're seeing increasing numbers, and you know, children 11 to 16, you know, about a third of those are using land-based. From our own local estimates, are using some form of land-based gambling, so it's not just the online activities as well. So yeah, hugely concerning.
Thinking of that, are the current safeguards around gambling advertising sufficient to protect young people and children? And if not, which I can see you all shaking your heads, what needs to change? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually shocking. So data from 2020 found that in children and young people who gamble, up to 20% of them already have some degree of problem gambling or are at risk of developing it. And often parents are kind of shocked when I talk about this because they may not be aware. It's stigmatised, right? It's hidden. Often parents may not be aware of what's happening. I think that the key thing that needs to be done to address this is to radically change our approach to advertising in this country. As I mentioned earlier, you know, TV, sponsorship of football matches, front page of most of our newspapers except The Guardian being the one that decided to stop advertising gambling a while ago. You know, in other countries, they have bans on either all types of gambling adverts or the more damaging types of gambling through the day, so only appearing after the watershed. For example. And so I think like changing regulation on that front is sorely needed, and that's what's going to make the difference, because these children and young people are just being saturated with adverts, even though it's illegal for companies to be deliberately promoting to children, and young people below a certain age. In effect, the adverts are everywhere. That's the problem.
And is there an issue specifically around social media for younger people? So the way that they kind of consume data is different perhaps to our generation, and is there more that needs to be done around things like Instagram, TikTok, the way that young people interact with them?
And I would just add YouTube into that as well, because again, generational shift, young people get a lot of their viewing through YouTube, and what we see from the adverts is that the Gambling Commission acknowledge that online adverts are more likely to be seen by children and young people, so they're knowingly pushing the online activity. The sort of measures they put in place is they'll increasingly put safer messaging where they think young people. Actually, we know that that's not impactful, but those adverts themselves will be filled with things that appeal more to young people. They're using the tactics of appealing to younger generation. Bright, shiny cartoons, Lucky Charms, all of those kind of things that are, draw young people in to be attracted into it. And it's across, I would say, the spectrum of online engagement for young people. So social media is one route, but actually we mustn't forget the other forms of online activity, such as YouTube, where young people spend a lot of their time.
Fair to say that the gambling industry is targeting children to create a new customer base. Is that fair to say, or is that going a stretch too far?
I would probably say that that we can see from the adverts there are things there which appeal very much to younger children.
Just to add very quickly, we see in other jurisdictions where countries have banned influencer marketing and banned the slot streaming and so on to try and get a bit of a grip on this. We've just done a review of all European gambling, advertising and marketing legislations, and comparatively Britain has one of the most liberal regimes with the fewest restrictions. Now, I would say the other key aspect on
interventions worked. Have you done the work so by banning it then improve the situation? Because that's what we'd be most interested in.
So yes, so that's the next step on. At the minute we're mapping the terrain.
We don't know yet.
Okay. Well, we do have some evidence from some countries. It's an evolving landscape, but yeah, that would be the next step on for us. But one of the critical things is obviously the relationship between gambling and sports. And we talk about football all the time, but it's not just football, it's esports, for example. We did some research where we looked at the sponsorship of esports team. 50% of esports teams had gambling sponsors. They have betting partners. They have their key esports professionals doing YouTube, TikTok videos promoting the brand that support their team. Now, that obviously has clear appeal to young people, and it's very overlooked.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand back to you, Jo.
Jo Platt.
Hello, hi. So I'm guesting from the Culture, Media, Sport Committee. So I'm interested in the previous committee's report that was published, the Immersive and Addictive Technologies report. But there was also a subsequent report in 2023 which specifically mentioned loot boxes, which the government rejected. So do you think there's still a case for regulation? And if so, what could that look like?
Professor Wardle, you mentioned that
yes,
earlier.
I did mention loot boxes. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there is still a case for regulation because I have a very good colleague who would be able to provide you with the details. The self-regulatory approach hasn't been working, and he has been monitoring that, and I know he's currently writing papers on this. And I mean, it all comes down to how you define what gambling is, and are you betting on it? Is it betting on something for the chance of winning something of value to you? Now, within these games, the things that are within loot boxes have immense value to the people who are playing them. They're not just this digital commodity. It's not just like a sticker or a toy. Actually, those objects have value within the games. They're part of the game economy. They can be shared, they can be traded. In some games, you can take them outside of the game in which you're playing, and you can then use them as collateral in other systems. The skins that are within the loot boxes can then be bet on skin betting websites. And again, we have longitudinal evidence that shows that skin betting amongst young adults is as risky as online slots, for example. So, there is a case for much stronger regulation. Again, coming back to what I've said before, that does not rely on self-regulation and voluntary action from the industry.
Absolutely. Can I just go to Lucy, because I know obviously you have mentioned loot boxes, just to get your take on what you think we should be able to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably defer to Professor Wardle in terms of her expertise in this. But absolutely, it's around that forming of that early engagement, and it does reach much younger children. And it's a bit like the going to the penny falls at the seaside when you were a child and normalising some of that. So, and what we see is that the level of risk isn't understood. So you change people's risk threshold through it. Because children and young people don't understand, at the same level as an adult, what they're risking in terms of that. So it's something that would absolutely need to be controlled. But I would defer to Professor Wardle in terms of what might be impactful in that.
And just to come back quickly, the honourable member had raised the question: why do we look at gambling? This is a prime example of why we look at gambling. Look at the complexity of the commercial ecosystem that's underpinning the provision of these products. You've got this intersection between gambling and gaming. It's a vast ecosystem with very powerful members and corporations who are wanting to promote these products. The same is true for the gambling industry itself. Imagine if the alcohol industry or the tobacco industry had real-time instant access to every time you took a sip of alcohol, every time you took a cigarette out of a packet, what they might have done with that information. This is why gambling is so important to look at, because there is no other similar substance that has that commercial power that underpins its provision.
The last 20 years. Yeah.
Yes, in the last 20 years.
Thank you very much. Greg Stafford.
Thank you very much. I've got some set questions that I want to ask, but I want to just quickly follow up on the children and the young people's point. Where do you see parental responsibility coming into this?
Shall I start? Yep. It's a really interesting question. And I think obviously there is a role for parental responsibility and teaching your children about risk and about these products. But equally, I think anyone who has got children, as I have, knows that it is incredibly difficult to constantly understand all the different products they are playing, all the different features that are embedded within games, and to be able to monitor and to do that. So that's why I think there needs to be more support and more regulation. You need to be able to trust, actually, if your child is going online, they're going into a safe environment and they are not going to be exploited by these commercial entities. So I think there is absolutely a role for parental responsibility and to have these conversations, but equally it needs to be supported by corporations not taking advantage of children and young people.
I would probably just add that I think it's so complex and is moving so quickly, and we all joke, don't we, about not being able to program our video recorders and all the rest of it because the generations move so quickly, that we mustn't enter into the industry narrative about placing the responsibility on individuals. There is actually some corporate responsibility around how we make sure that the risk of engagement in gambling-related activity is understood. And when it's embedded in games, not pulled out of this is a risk, are you sure you want to do this? Which most of the stuff that's embedded in gaming isn't. It just looks like it's part of the gameplay. Actually, how much would that flag? I don't sit next to, I didn't when they were young, I didn't sit next to my children and sit next to them whilst they were spending 45 minutes on a video game. I trusted that the game that I had bought or I was enabling them to watch would trigger anything, would have those safeguards in. So I think we just have to be careful around that personal
I kind of get that, but my parents didn't sit with me and say don't smoke for every single moment of the day. They didn't give me cigarettes. They didn't say don't drink alcohol as an 11-year-old. They didn't give me alcohol. So my point is really, we've talked about banning smartphones. I mean, why would you just not say to your children, I'm sorry, you're not playing this game, you're not having a smartphone until you are responsible? I think it seems to me we're over-egging the pudding here.
Yes, so I think there is a role for parental responsibility, and we know from the research that family background in relation to gambling and other addictive products is one important contributing factor to whether or not children then develop the addiction later on. So I think having a sort of nurturing family environment where there's open discussion is important, and I do think parents should place limits, for example, on whether their children are engaging in gambling or using the internet too much. I think the challenge though is for parents is the education around that. So as a parent, actually what should you do? There aren't really the guidelines in place. So I was discussing with colleagues earlier today from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, so talking about online screen time for children and where the limit should be. Actually, we don't know because the independent research hasn't been done, but there are independent materials on the internet to help parents and give advice in practical terms around these issues. But partly it's an educational thing as well. So, I'm not saying we need to have education programs just rolled out immediately into schools about this or into parenting classes, for example, but we should be working with independent organisations to develop those and show that they work and then roll them out. I think there is a massive gap there in terms of education, but we need to make sure it's not industry players going in there. We have seen that already with education in schools, often run by charities that are directly funded by the gambling industry through voluntary donations, and it's quite concerning and they're not evidence-based.
Can I just add really quickly, it's really difficult for parents to take parental responsibility if, as a nation, we have underestimated the risk, the scale of harms, and there isn't that level of awareness of the actual risk that is associated with these different products. And we have seen that framing being very persuasive over the past 20 years of saying this is a tiny minority of people, it's a few disordered people, the rest of the population are fine. And it's very difficult then to actually expect parents in that context, which is the normative majority context, to expect people to actually be able to take that responsibility.
What would you compare it to?
Sorry, can I?
Sorry, just if I can interject just for a moment, and it comes back to my colleague's question before. We're underestimating the harm. What's the comparator for a layperson? Gambling is as bad as something that we understand.
It's as bad as alcohol and substance use in terms of its wider social harms, and its impact on people's mental health. If it's that accumulation, but it's as yet unknown, and I think there's a real complexity. I think if you were to say to children, don't smoke, and then discover that cigarettes were hidden in sweeties, you'd be like, oh, that's terrible. If you were to say to your children, don't drink, and then you discover that alcohol was hidden in fruit juice, you go, oh my God, that's terrible. Gambling is hidden and embedded. It's hugely complex. It's not as simple as don't do A, but you can do B, because it's pervasive. And you also can't see it in the same way. So you will see your child staggering home from the park, having had a little bit too much to drink. You won't know that your child is sitting in their bedroom, gambling with money which they may or may not have, and may or may not understand what it is that they are doing. They'll probably knowingly drink in the park, but they might not understand that they are gambling and running real risk. And I think that's some of the difference that there is in this. Now, I'm not saying that there's absolutely a place for parental responsibility, but I think we also make sure that our population is geared up to be able to take some of that responsibility, and some of that is us beginning to articulate and explain that in a different way.
Not sure I entirely agree, but we'll move on. Just so I understand your background and context, do you gamble or have you ever gambled?
I played the Penny Falls and Skegness last week.
I've bought lottery tickets when I was much younger, but at legal age. I suppose I've invested in the stock market, which some would say more risk type products could be a type of gambling.
Yes, I used to gamble quite regularly, particularly on the horse racing. In fact, I was probably one of the earliest female adopters of an online gambling account. I had one in 2000. I don't do that particularly very much anymore.
So why is it okay for you to do it, but not others?
I think we're not saying it's okay for us and not others. What we're saying is there needs to be greater restrictions around the way in which gambling is provided and marketed and regulated. Now, the gambling that I did was very low limits, and actually I could take or leave it. And in fact, actually, most people in Britain who gamble in a very similar way to the way that I gambled. And quite often, a lot of the things that we're talking about, people would say, well, fine, I'm not so committed to this thing that actually if you make it a little bit harder for me, I'm going to absolutely go and search for something else to do. I would also say I did have the experience of being that person who gambled my last £5 and then found I couldn't afford to go and buy myself dinner that night. And for me, that was the moment at which I actually said, I'm not going to continue doing this because it was causing me harms. Now, I was very lucky and fortunate that I was able to do so. It wasn't as pervasive as it is now. So again, it's having that recognizing that there are different ways that people can experience these harms, and it's about putting protections around people.
I mean, I'll let you two answer the question, but therefore, in the context of the white paper and the context that you've just been talking about, what therefore would you see as the top two priorities if the new government were only going to implement two things, given the context that you've said that for some people gambling is perfectly fine and you're not seeking to ban gambling? Within that context, what would you see would be the top two things that you would like to see roll forward?
So rolling forward, I would actually like to see a different approach to advertising and sponsorship than they're taking. I think we need to have much more severe restrictions and greater protections at a population level, particularly for children and young people, but also for those who are harmed, and to not normalise this behaviour. We think gambling is normalised because we see it so much in the advertising. But when you actually look at the data, only 16% of the population have bet on sports in the past year. It is actually a minority behaviour, yet we feel it's a majority behaviour. It's a very different complexion on these things. So I would absolutely look at restructuring the way we do. We're focusing on advertising and sponsorship, and then I would look at having greater regulatory restrictions and protections around a wider range of products. Absolutely welcome the focus on online slots, but we also need similar protections on land-based slots, and we also need similar protections on online casino products, which all have a higher risk of harm.
So I'm not of the view that we should stop everybody gambling. In the same way, I'm not of the view that we should stop everybody drinking. But what we should be doing is harm reduction strategies and trying to reduce the negative effects of gambling through the ways that we've discussed. In terms of potential priorities from the white paper, I think, much stronger regulation of the advertisements and sponsorship would make a big difference. And the other thing is the levy. But as I alluded to earlier, the critical thing there is, okay, but who's going to administer it and what are the safeguards to make sure that gets to the right people and that the decisions aren't influenced by people with vested interests?
And similarly, I'm not sure any of us have said that we want to ban on gambling. It's about creating the environment and reducing the exposure that might lead to harmful impacts. And so the two things around creating that different environment for me would be around managing and controlling the advertising and sponsorship, and ensuring independent regulation and treatment services.
Thank you. I did have another question on the levy, but I think I'll hand over to you, Joe, for that.
Joe Robertson.
All right, thank you. What's a safe level of gambling?
Well, sorry.
I was going to say, do you want to go first? I don't mind.
I'll have a go ahead. That's a very difficult question to answer. One could take the view that, gambling has become unsafe when a person is experiencing significant negative consequences from it. And there's various ways of defining that and various measurement tools one could use. So, for example, you could use an instrument that measures gambling-related harms that's been validated. If a person is scoring on that, then they're engaging in an unsafe level. But just finally, just to make the brief point, it's not only a level suggests maybe like frequency or amount, but it's not only that that's important, it's things such as loss of control, the ways it's impacting different areas of life and so on. And that's partly why I say it's quite a complicated question to answer. Thank you.
So just to add to that, so we have some international colleagues, 14 different jurisdictions, who have looked at providing lower risk gambling guidelines, which is essentially saying, what's the level of gambling at which, if you then go above that level, it becomes at heightened risk. And their recommendations are not to gamble more than once a week, not to gamble on 2 different activities, and not to spend more than 1% of your income. Now, we don't have equivalent evidence base for the UK, but like I say, that was based on 14 different countries, and they all came out with roughly the same recommendations. That's not to say that below those levels is safe, but that's to say that's the point at which risk starts to increase. And from what Sam has said, there are lots of different complexities and considerations that you need to take into account about defining what is safe for an individual person based on their context, their circumstances and their experiences.
So the NHS Health Survey, which I think is 2021 was the last one we've had, identifies 0.3% of people engaged in problem gambling. Is that a useful measure? Bearing in mind it's the NHS's own health survey.
Yeah, it's yes and no, because actually in 2021 the Health Survey for England had to change its methodology, and also it was capturing data that was collected during lockdown, so the estimates will be much lower than previous health surveys. And in fact the 2021 Health Survey itself has said please don't use the 2021 Health Survey to look at trends. And what's really important is to think about what is being captured in that statistic. So within that statistic, you're essentially using an instrument, often something called the Problem Gambling Severity Index, which asks 9 questions, which comprises of a range of behavioural symptoms and some adverse consequences experienced from gambling. However, it doesn't capture the wider range of harms that people experience. It doesn't capture the harms to others that are experienced. Now, the gambling survey for Great Britain included a much wider range of questions on adverse consequences from gambling. And then what we saw from that is that people who experienced, there was an additional set of harms that aren't being captured by the questions in the health survey for England. So there are an additional set of people who are being missed by some of those metrics. So I think, yes, it is useful to capture some of this data, but it's also really important to recognise they are not capturing all the consequences, all the harms that are experienced. And for that reason, we say that these gambling, negative experiences of gambling have been undercounted and are underrepresented.
If the problem gambling, or a lot of the problem gambling, is done at home, then surely during COVID would have been a time where the figure could have been expected to be higher.
No, because you had about 5 to 6 months where land-based gambling was closed. And although we talk a lot about online gambling, land-based gambling is still really important. It captures about a third of GGY. So actually what was really interesting during the lockdown period was that it was the first time that we saw downward movement in problem gambling estimates through the Gambling Commission's statistics. And what that shows you is there is a relationship between supply and the movement of harms.
So what should the goal of a prevention strategy be? Should it be to reduce gambling within the population, or should it be targeted more at the specific harms from a small percent of people who gamble?
And that's a really important question. And to understand that, you really need to understand the nature of the relationship between population consumption and the relationship between harms. So does the more that a population does of this thing, then therefore mean there are more harms? We have some evidence, some tentative evidence from Great Britain that suggests that that is the case. And once you know that that is the case, then your focus becomes on shifting the consumption curve. So you shift population consumption downwards, rather than just focusing on what we might have called the so-called disordered few. I can see Lucy wanted to come in there.
I couldn't agree more. I think if we just focus on the people who have already reached that threshold of being in the whatever the top percentage is, actually we're missing that much larger proportion of people who will be experiencing harm on the way to getting to that threshold. So I think that we have to take a population approach to helping people understand, as we do with almost all of the other risks, of how do you balance the harms and benefits of an activity. So we have to take a population-based approach, and that has to have a number of different factors to it. There are roles for treatment, there's roles for support, there's roles for awareness-raising activity, but there's also making sure that we've got that independent regulatory approach that sits behind to make sure that the environment in which all of that is operating is well-sited.
I mean, this weekend we've probably got the biggest mass gambling participation event in the UK that's going back decades in the Grand National. But I guess most people would agree that that is probably low-level risk gambling, given its sort of cultural significance, but it's where a lot of children may first witness this idea of putting money down. I think the problem I'm sort of identifying is that human beings are naturally risk-taking. Our entire banking system, our entire economic system is based on gambling. The Chancellor has to make decisions on borrowing based on gambling, prediction, running risk. We need to be able to target a particular activity within gambling rather than gambling itself. And that's what I'm trying to tease out, whether that strategy is about addictive behaviours within a wider gambling sector, which is not in and of itself harmful, and whether we should be maybe producing some sort of kite mark type system to companies that are, providing safe activity that is lawful.
I think part of the problem of that approach is many companies in the sector may have a range of products, and if the aim is profit, then there'll be a natural tendency to get involved in more risky products or more harmful products, because we know from research that a sizable proportion of profit from gambling companies is from people who do have the addiction. So I'll give one example, which is the National Lottery, right? So that's run by a company under a license that might not generate profit, but that same company is making money in other countries, for example, from addictive products, as you would expect a gambling company to do. So I actually think it's unlikely that you would have a particular company that is only engaging in very, very low risk types of gambling.
And just to come back to the point that I made earlier, is that I think this is why it's really important to think about regulations of products based on their propensity for risk, and that is proportionate to that risk. Now, we have really good evidence on which products are the most associated with risks. They are the fast, continuous formats of gambling. They are your online casinos, their offline counterparts, your electronic gaming machines and your slot machines. Now, the white paper deals with online slots only, and to me, that is one of the big gaps of the white paper.
Thank you. And can I just finish with the levy, obviously, as we're transitioning from voluntary levy to statutory levy, how we capture and keep that third sector knowledge in treatment, because it's the third sector largely that has been providing the treatment for those who are suffering harm from gambling. And finish up on a point as well about that data, this idea of actually data gathering can help companies target those. I think it was you that said it, Professor Chamberlain. How can we use the levy to address that targeting of people who have identified themselves as at risk, and ensure that the third sector knowledge from charities, etc., will be kept and retained?
Really good question. I think that the levy, first of all, needs to be ring-fenced and shielded from conflicts of interest in relation to the industry. You're quite right that there's a lot of expertise in the third sector. For example, we as a service work with GamFam, which is an independent charity. It's deliberately been avoiding taking voluntary funds from the industry, and they're doing great work, and they're evidencing what they're doing. So I would argue there's many third sector organisations out there that would be really keen to work, for example, with the NHS, if the NHS are responsible for providing treatment. Also important is the public health element, which may sit separately from that with OHID or however that's administered. But I think there's principles across that which relate to each funding stream needs to be really tightly controlled at each level to think about, minimising conflicts of interest. And the other thing is that I think it needs to be ring-fenced. I just wanted to make that point because, for example, if you divert money to prevention or treatment through a levy, unless that is ring-fenced at the end, at every stage, so for example for healthcare, it will be what was NHS England, whatever that may be next, through to the Integrated Care Board, through to the NHS Trust. At each level there's a risk of funds being diverted unless it's ring-fenced further away from gambling. And you would see that, I think, I'll defer to my colleagues, but for public health as well. If it's not guaranteed ring-fenced to actually tackle gambling harms, it might well just end up being siphoned off to address budget shortfalls elsewhere.
You don't have anything
Thank you
more to
very
add? We
much.
can move on.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I've got one very final question. I noticed that all three of you, at various stages, including in the very last answer, mentioned conflicts of interest, vested interests, in the way that the wider industry is engaging with this space. Can you just outline for us, I'm just really struck, it was almost every question, what does that look like? What are they doing? What should we be live to? Can I start with Sam?
Yes, so I mean, as a sort of researcher who's never taken funds from voluntary donations from industry, what I've seen in this field is it's been really difficult to do research into prevention, policy, education, treatments, because for decades in the UK we've had a situation where the only funding available of any size, any significance to do those kinds of activities has been from the industry through voluntary donations. And in parallel, there's been a lack of funding from our trusted funding bodies. So, for example, charities like Welcome, MRC, the NIHR, they've tended not to invest in research in relation to gambling-related harms.
Does it necessarily follow that just because the money came from that source, that the research isn't independent and done properly? I mean, I'm trying to understand.
Sure.
Sorry.
I'll pass to Heather in a moment. What I would say is that certain organisations do have rigorous safeguards in place. So I would be like, if Wellcome are administering funds, that's a reputable organisation that thinks about conflicts of interest and isn't closely linked to a particular industry. What you have in pragmatic terms is basically the industry has been giving cash to one massive charity that then has been handing out that money to various organisations. I'm not saying that all of that work is invalid, but what I would say is many of the good researchers in the field of gambling would have not been prepared to take that money because of ethical and other concerns. So what you have is a dearth of good quality research, in my opinion, over the last decades.
Heather?
For full disclosure, up until 2018, I did take funding from GambleAware, and I did quite a lot of work for GambleAware, and that was prior to joining academia. What I would say, reflecting on those experiences, is not necessarily on the way I actually did my research. It was how the research priorities and questions were determined in the first place, and how they then reflected particular viewpoints, how the industry were consulted on what those questions might be. And then it was about control of the messaging from the outputs, the communication strategy around that.
They would have an input in how you discuss
absolutely.
the paper.
I mean, I remember quite clearly having a conversation where I was asked to remove a particular key finding from a press release with the chief executive of my funder. And that's, for somebody who's, in there.
Which funder was that?
That was when it was with GambleAware. And so, it's these kind of things. It's not just the kind of, is the research itself biased? The research can be done quite well. It's the soft power that sits around it that shapes what research is done and how that is then communicated. Now, you don't have that with the funding councils that Sam has talked about. I've since got a fellowship grant from Wellcome, had none of these experiences. I work for NIHR, again, none of these experiences. And so it's those kind of things that you also have to pay attention to. And it's those kind of things that researchers don't talk about. So it's very difficult to actually evidence how these things are actually influencing the evidence base.
Very quickly, last question.
Just probably bringing it out of research and into the real world a bit, I would agree that we also see what Heather has just, what Professor Wardle's just explained in terms of the framing of the narrative around where treatment should sit. So again, it's about the personal responsibility. It's that person has got a problem. What we're not doing is moving into understanding how the industry is contributing to. And
would they bat away research questions that were about that? Is that what you're insinuating? That there would just be certain areas that just wouldn't be allowed to be funded by them?
So I think it's about the choice of the research question and how that research question is framed. So one of the packages of work that I worked on was trying to understand the impact of FOBTs, fixed odd betting terminals. At that point, this is going back over 10 years ago. And the way the research questions were actually framed in the end very much moved us away from really understanding how harmful these products might be towards looking at, can you identify people who are playing in a harmful way?
And if you didn't do the question you thought was most useful as a researcher, they would pull the funding?
No, because it's commissioned funding. So it's the research questions are set and then they tender for that project.
Oh, I understand. Okay, thank you. Very quickly, and then we must move on.
I'll be brief. I just want to recommend the work of Jim Orford, who's written quite a lot, because there's a lot of complexities in this area that you're raising. And I would also highlight what we saw with big tobacco historically in relation to how the narrative was influenced by funding.
And you see a direct parallel between how big tobacco operated and how gambling companies are operating?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
We cover that in our reports quite
That's very helpful. We will certainly take that into evidence. Thank you so much, first panel. May I ask the second panel to come up? Thank you very much.
Look at this man's cherry smiley face. I'm a little man with the other tie. They can't be here.
Welcome to the second panel. Much appreciated. We're running slightly behind, so we are going to keep questions and answers snappy, aren't we? Oh, yes, indeed. We're going to also start by asking our panel to introduce themselves and what they do. May we start with Tim Miller, please?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Tim Miller. I'm Executive Director of Policy and Research at the Gambling Commission. I also oversee the Gambling Commission's work in implementing the government's white paper on gambling.
Thank you so much. Henrietta Bowden-Jones, please.
Hello, I'm a National Advisor for NHS England. I'm a psychiatrist with a clinical background. I'm the person who set up the first NHS gambling clinic in this country in 2008, following my doctorate at Imperial College in Neuroscience in Addictions that led me to think this was required.
Thank you very much. And Andrew Vereker, is that correct?
Hi, I'm Andrew Vereker. I'm a Deputy Director in OHID in the Department of Health.
Thank you very much. Danny Beals.
Thank you very much. We heard, I think quite compellingly from the previous panel, which I know you sat in on, about the need for kind of shifting awareness about the realities of gambling, the harms, and breaking down stigma related to kind of approaching services for support if people are struggling with gambling addiction. I think the government's also kind of talked previously about this cultural shift. Do you agree that that cultural shift is needed? And if so, how in your work do you plan to support that level of cultural shift?
Thank you for this great first question for our panel. I started looking after people with a gambling addiction at a time that was coinciding with the liberalisation of gambling through the implementation in 2007 of the 2005 Act. So I've been living it for almost 20 years and witnessing the changes in people's behaviour and in the harm. And it was very early on in 2009 when I realised things were not looking great, and there were queues and queues of people in Soho wanting to spend their lunchtimes betting on fixed odd betting terminals. And so it's been since then really that I've been campaigning for a change. So the work that has led to the white paper, the collaboration between clinicians, lived experiences, researchers, that has led to this is a momentous moment for us in terms of a new era. I do believe it's time to change things. It's time for a more transparent era. You've been hearing a lot about conflict of interest and the importance of having transparency. But maybe from my perspective as National Advisor, it's also an opportunity for the country to unite in providing the help that is needed. Someone mentioned the voluntary sector, and I do believe this opportunity now for NHS England to commission the whole national treatment services in absolute collaboration with the voluntary sector, within which there are thousands of people who've been doing great work in gambling and who want to continue doing it. But I think the sharing of data, the ability to finally have a snapshot of the country at any one time, who is presenting for help, which areas. Paulette mentioned, how do you know what's happening here, what's happening, what are we doing to tackle inequalities? Well, to me, the dream has come true, because by the time our systems are able to collect data in the same way from every single treatment provider across the nation, we will have a very good idea of where the money should go and where there is enough money for the moment and we just expand at the usual rate. So the dream is really to identify pockets of harm, populations in whom harm is rife, understand the causes by using the money invested in research in this independent way, to properly address the questions that will arise and to make people's lives easier. It is a horrible addiction. As I said, I have treated thousands and thousands of people. Not enough has been said about suicide and suicidal ideation.
What are the rates in this country compared to others?
We know in this country that there are anything from 300 to 500 suicides a year. But again, can I go back to the fact that there has
Is that
not
higher
been,
or lower than other places? Do we know?
I have no
We don't
idea.
know. Okay.
It's difficult for me to say. But I'd like to talk about this country where I do have an understanding of the fact that we have not sponsored enough research into this area. We have really the need to fully, and I think there are ways of doing it by data sharing. If you don't allow industry to control all its data without sharing it with researchers, if you allow transparency, you allow us to identify vulnerabilities. You may prevent many lives if you understand patterns of play, high-risk play, affordability and inability to afford gambling, and what it means to lose your home.
That's really helpful, thank you. Andrew and Tim, I don't know if there's, I think it's quite a comprehensive response about the things which need to support that cultural shift. Is there anything further you think is needed to enable that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, question around the need for change, it's probably worth reflecting that, we're probably slap bang in the middle of arguably one of the biggest periods of kind of regulatory change, regulatory reform since the Gambling Act itself was passed. There's that rare moment of kind of cross-party consensus that really kind of fell in behind the Gambling White Paper. And from our perspective as the regulator, we're now 2 years into actually delivering a lot of that change. So in that time, huge amount of change is already in place. We've implemented financial vulnerability checks to identify kind of an early stage risk. We've made changes to direct marketing to prohibit cross-selling from some of the kind of lower risk products to some of those.
So you're telling us what you're already doing, I suppose. So I guess my question is, do you think that what you're already doing is enough to enable the cultural shift, or do you think more is needed? Because you're telling us what's happened, I suppose. So,
look, absolutely more is needed because we are only partway through delivering this programme of reform. And I think, as earlier witnesses have said, this is a landscape that has been rapidly changing over the last few years and will continue to. And so from our perspective as a regulator, we are constantly shifting and adapting to those changing risks. I mean, a good example of that, which has been a huge change in how we operate as a regulator, is the kind of the risk that comes from illegal overseas websites targeting particularly the most vulnerable consumers here. So we've seen this trend of people that have taken often the very difficult step here to self-exclude from gambling because of the challenges they faced, actually being targeted by illegal websites based overseas. And what that's meant for us as a regulator is shifting from some of the traditional ways of regulating the industry here at home to having to work, for example, more closely with the likes of Google and people like that. So over the last year, for example, we've had around about 80,000 URLs of illegal websites taken down by Google, where we've found examples of these overseas sites targeting particularly vulnerable consumers. So that illustrates the need for us to be constantly adapting, constantly changing to the risks that people might face.
Andrew,
thank you.
I've got a second question, so
shall I answer that one very briefly?
Please do.
We heard compelling evidence from the first panel about the wide-ranging negative effects that gambling can have. You asked whether we should do more. The government in its manifesto obviously has a commitment to strengthening protections from a Department of Health OHID perspective. Through our health mission, we are committed to shortening the time spent in ill health by preventing harms before they occur. In that context, I think the levy is a real opportunity, as the previous panel have said, to improve treatment, to enable high quality research, and to support effective prevention activity. So there's definitely more that we can do through the levy. I might just say it's not all about spending, and I would also draw the committee's attention to the clinical guidelines that were published by NICE earlier this year, recommending that health professionals ask questions about gambling at health checks and when people come into contact with the health profession, and that is a really welcome step to make sure that people have support and access where they need it.
Well, thank you. And I think we heard quite compellingly about the role of advertising and marketing in the previous panel. Do you think that the fact that 55% of Premier League clubs are now sponsored by gambling companies and the proliferation of online advertising in all the forms we've heard, do you think that is aiding cultural change, a better understanding and breaking down of stigma around gambling addiction? or do you think it's likely to worsen the situation?
Are you asking Andrew?
It's an open question, really, to whoever feels best and most expert
If
to
no
answer.
one can answer, don't.
I mean, I would emphasise again the government's got a manifesto commitment generally to strengthen protections. I recognise those concerns about advertising that are slightly out of scope of the levy, and we have just been appointed Prevention Commissioner, but we are working with DCMS, who are the lead on regulation, to consider how we can best deliver against the government's manifesto commitment and our health mission.
I mean, so from our perspective as a regulator, we gave formal advice to government around the time of the white paper around advertising. Although we're not the regulator for that, ASA deals with that. Clearly, they're a close partner. In particular, what we said is there needs to be a focus on ensuring that advertising is much less kind of visible and accessible, particularly to children, but also to other people that might be vulnerable. So some of the specific recommendations we made, particularly around sport, for example, was a ban on front of shirt sponsorship, which I think is being taken forward on a voluntary basis. But we also recommended that there be
55% and 55% of Premier clubs are now sponsored, I think, by gambling companies. It doesn't seem very voluntary at the moment.
So that's due to come into effect in 26-27, the voluntary ban. But we also said that in addition, you should look at restricting the amount of advertising actually in stadia themselves. So, you know, the electronic hoardings.
You got any sense that there's been a step down, I suppose, towards that deadline? It feels to me that we're stepping up rather than stepping down the levels.
So I think, in terms of the impact of any of those changes, actually, like with everything that's in the white paper, we will need to properly evaluate the impact. If you look overseas, for example, where some of these bans on sponsorship have already been in place, Italy, Belgium would be two examples. What we've seen is actually football clubs there finding any opportunity they can to try and circumvent those bans by, for example, no longer having a formal betting sponsor on their shirt, but actually then taking one of those companies' other brands. So a lot of them have like a kind of sports news website, which acts as a way of kind of channeling customers to the betting website, and use those for their sponsorship instead. So actually, if you're going to put these things in place, what you do have to do is have proper evaluation to make sure you've actually delivered the outcome that you're expecting. So I think, in terms of the voluntary ban, we will have to see how effective that does show itself to be.
With the level of harm we've heard comparable to alcohol, I think was the previous panel's kind of summation. You've talked quite compelling, Professor, about the level of suicides related to gambling. Do you think that we should be looking at similar restrictions on advertising and marketing, particularly to children, of gambling?
I'm glad to have a moment to contribute my bit from a lifelong clinical perspective. I do believe that we are in a position that feels wrong at the moment with the normalisation of gambling in sport, and in my role I actually run the Young People's Gambling Services as well as a national clinic and as well as a National Centre for Gaming Disorders, which I started in 2019 for the NHS, the only centre. So I have constant reminders, everyday reminders, that people in this country are pretty much unable nowadays to differentiate between what is true sport and what is gambling.
Does that explain the difference in, we heard from the earlier panel, the 0.3% response of problem gambling in the NHS Health Survey?
I was just talking about the perception in this country, not just by young people. I see a lot of old people.
I'm asking.
Yeah, it is about. This isn't about explaining the prevalence and the reason. That there are many other reasons why we've got the prevalence that we have. But I do think banning front of shirt advertising and not having advertising in sport generally would do us a lot of good, and I feel very strongly about this, as will most of the colleagues you will be speaking to. So sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to give that.
But it's linked, so because at 0.3%, it doesn't feel like that's a big problem.
I see.
But it is a big problem, and that's NHSE, and you work with NHSE. So I'm wondering, for that figure, should we be revisiting that figure, or do you stand by it?
I'm the clinical advisor for NHS England, and I've had no involvement in that 0.3. What I do know is that as Professor Wardle, who is your specialist and advisor in terms of research, has stated, there are other prevalence studies like the 2.5% that are much more realistic. I think
you'd agree with that. Thank you.
I do absolutely.
Just wanted to get under the skin of that. Sorry, back to you, Danny. Apologies.
I mean, Timmy, I don't know if you want to comment.
If I could come in on that, because we collect the official statistics around this. Last year we launched the Gambling Survey for Great Britain, which is the largest survey of its kind anywhere in the world, which gave us, in terms of people scoring 8+ on the PGSI, a rate of 2.5%. Yeah. Now, I think what's important to say is that it's a new methodology, so it's bedding in, but I think what we felt as the regulator was that relying simply on the health survey didn't give us a good enough or contemporaneous enough picture. What we were finding was that it was taking a long time for that data to come through. It was being done piecemeal in different parts of Britain. So I recognise health is a devolved matter, but we are a Britain-wide regulator. So we are now building a much more comprehensive picture of harm and prevalence across Britain.
Thank you very much. Andrew George.
Thank you very much. In view of time, I'll kind of direct this question perhaps at Henrietta. There's been a reference already to the NICE guidelines published only a couple of months ago. So the question really is that sufficient? Is it welcomed? And if there are issues about the implementation of it, what are those challenges and how can those be overcome?
Thank you for asking about such an important topic. Mm-hmm. Just to give you context, when I started the first NHS clinic, I had no guidelines. I had to rely on American data in order to understand what treatments might be helpful, research data. I then based my work on the Monash guidelines, which were very basic compared to what happened later in England. Guidelines? The Australian guidelines from many, many years ago. There was a real need, and I'm very grateful to the people who campaigned, including Gambling with Lies, who led this campaign to get the NICE guidelines done. I was the psychiatrist on those guidelines. And the reason why these are so important is because the levy is a lot of money. Every year, an enormous amount of money will be allocated to this disease and to fighting the harms. And so we need to ensure that as treatment providers, I'm just talking of treatment now, but this applies to prevention and research, we are accountable for how we spend the money, and also we're accountable to our patients. We treat them with evidence-based treatments that we know have been deemed to be working. So as always, when you have an area that is so understudied, the hidden addiction, the addiction that no one really has cared about for a long time, not enough research has really existed for the NICE guidelines to be inundated with great research. The NICE guidelines have done their best to identify gaps, and in particular, Professor Chamberlain mentioned the need for randomized controlled trials. This is urgent. We need to understand whether if I give someone with a gambling disorder only CBT or CBT plus naltrexone, I want to know how quickly they're going to get better, how long they're going to stay totally gambling free for. Is it 6 months? Is it 3 years? Is it lifelong? And all of this is needed in order for me to sit here as a national advisor saying, we're doing a good job, and that job that you've paid for will continue to exert its influence in a positive way on the population long term. So NICE guidelines were needed. I'm grateful to NICE that they took us on, because there's a long waiting queue for NICE guidelines, and I think they understood about the harms enough to dedicate time to this. And I do believe that from the NICE guidelines, as my colleague here mentioned, there will be an implementation of other activities, such as making sure people in primary care ask about gambling, making sure we train people to the level of their abilities that they're being paid for to do their job with gamblers. And therefore, if you're a patient at whatever end of the spectrum you arrive, whether you're arriving with a little bit of a worry about your gambling because you haven't paid your tax, to a raging gambling disorder where you've lost your family home, you will get the right help.
So I mean, is the 50% split in terms of the resource going into treatment the right level? I mean, because it sounds to me like there's a lot of experimentation going on within the treatment itself.
Not experimentation, no. We know our treatment works.
Trials? Okay. Right.
A randomized controlled trial is to not sit on what you're doing feeling that you're doing the best you can be. Yeah. It is a constantly dynamic system that allows new interventions to be evaluated, allows you to know whether if you treat people individually or in a group, it works the same way. That's not experimentation.
No, but there's still a lot of uncertainty as to which is most effective in terms of treatment.
No, we know that cognitive behavioral therapy and some pharmacotherapy is helpful. I wouldn't call it uncertainty. I would say that we are going to build on what we have, which, by the way, I sit on the WHO expert group. In England, we are doing a fantastic job, and we should be thankful, really, to this government and to all the bodies involved for allowing us to be doing this great job. We've got 15 clinics across the country. That is a very good position to be in.
I'll just finally ask, I mean, you've mentioned the wealth of money coming in through the levy. Are you saying that the resource is sufficient for this, and that actually those people who need to access treatment and support, actually there is sufficient resource there for that to be done?
Yeah, important question. I believe personally today that money is an extremely good starting point, and I know that every 5 years things will be reviewed. I think there is enough money for us to properly implement what we need to implement, both in research, prevention and treatment, and understand whether we're meeting all needs.
Okay.
If in 5 years' time we find that actually, because remember that we still feel that under 5% of people who need treatment are accessing treatment, okay? Let's say that in 2 years' time everyone decides to access treatment. I might change my answer to you next year if you interview me again. But for this year, yes.
So in terms of the population of people that are suffering from this addiction, I mean, what proportion overall are actually seeking to access treatment at the moment?
Well, at the moment, relatively recent research states that it is still about 5%. Say it's 10%. We have a long way to go, which brings me back to the questions earlier. How do we reach the people who are hard to reach? Where are the barriers?
Coming to that. Yeah.
Thank you. Ben Coleman.
Yes, thank you very much. Interesting responses. I'd like to ask Professor Bowden-Jones and also perhaps bring in the other two interviews. The NHS England's been been appointed the Commissioner of Treatment Services. It's being abolished. We also have a huge role for public health at a local authority level in combating gambling as well as alcohol and drug misuse. Where should commissioning sit in the future? And should it be more localised? And what would the risks be, as well as the opportunities of doing that? Perhaps I could ask you first, Mr. Vereker.
I mean, look, ministers have made their statements on the future of NHS England, the department, NHS colleagues, NHSE colleagues, DCMS were working through what that means. I don't have...
What would be best, do you think, for people who are suffering from problem gambling?
But right now, I would also say I'm fully focused on delivering the prevention commissioning role from within OHID. That is immediately in front of me. I think there is a real opportunity from this year with the levy to do something genuinely different and put funding on a more stable footing. What the centre looks like in the future is something that will have to wait to be determined. If you're asking about sort of the role of place and national versus local, I think that's incredibly important question to raise. When I think about prevention, I think we will need to consider not only population level interventions and initiatives, as the panel raised earlier, but we'll also have to think about regional and local initiatives and supporting all of the good and best practice that is out there in the system.
Right, okay, Professor Jones.
Just to add, thank you for giving the overview. We've got a couple of years, as you know, to implement fully the next, how it's going to look, and this work has just started. But we have already been working extremely closely with DHSC, and their knowledge and their expertise in the world of gambling harms is fantastic. Having lived through it myself in terms of working with them for so long, I have no anxieties at all in relation to the delivery of the treatment that we've pledged to deliver, despite NHSC needing to hand over to a different shaped body.
When you say you have no difficulties, we obviously GPs are relatively uninformed, one understands, about some GPs are excellent.
Oh, you were just asking me about the ending of NHS England here. I can talk to you about primary care if you want to change and move on to that.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. But just going back to the original question, you asked about national. I think there is something very important going back to my idea of having a very clear oversight of who needs the money now urgently, who is doing great work but has enough, where are the pockets of populations requiring extra. If you have a national oversight, you're able to do that in a way that I don't think you can if you work in silos, as we have done a little bit in the past. I think primary care has an enormous role to play. We are planning to work very closely with primary care. We have advisory committees that will feed into all sorts of different levels of boards, including, very importantly, the advisory board to DCMS, and primary care will have a big seat at the table.
When you talk about the advisory board, it's very interesting because we have the Gambling Levy Programme Board, and the Department of Health and Social Care will sit on that. You're also going to have the advisory group to the board. Presumably, you think that the Department of Health should also sit on that, but should we also have public health representation on the advisory board? Separately from because there is a distinction in my mind between the Department of Health and between the NHS and public health.
Yes,
and
I
local
agree.
authorities.
I would always suggest that you can do no harm by bringing public health to the table in any community.
When you say no harm, would you actively advocate it?
Yes, absolutely. We wouldn't be here without the public health approach, which is what we advocated for in the Lords at their initial review that really changed things. Yeah.
Andrew, would you also expect to see yourselves or public health directors represented directly on the advisory group? The Gambling Levy Advisory Group.
So the first thing to say, as I think as you alluded to, is that the formal governance that will oversee the levy will include the Department of Health. So we'll have a seat at the table there. There will be both ministers and officials to have oversight of the levy and to sign off the allocations. The advisory group, which DCMS is setting up, I don't think has been defined. I would expect it to have a range of voices.
My question
is not sensible.
It is not perhaps asking for such a sort of broad political answer. Yes. Would you think it would be helpful for the advisory group to have clear, direct representation from public health professionals, such as your organisation or the Association of Directors of Public Health?
OHID is part of the Department for Health, so we'll get a seat at the table there. I would definitely think it would be sensible to have a public health voice on the advisory group.
Directors of Public Health, for example.
But that is still to be worked through with DCMS.
Okay, well, good. Let me just ask, if I may, about the third sector. Most of the support and the treatment happens outside the NHS. And what do you think the third sector's role is going to be in the new commissioning system, Professor?
Very, very important. As you say, they have been treating far, far more people than the NHS has. And for many years before, when I set up the first NHS clinic, I was fully reliant on very wonderful and helpful colleagues in the voluntary sector to teach me all they knew about here. I also learned from international colleagues, but it really was the passion and the commitment of the voluntary sector here. So the plan is to collaborate fully, and for the majority of people will continue to be seen by voluntary sector. The thing that we are going to focus on, and I'm very excited about, is that I'm having a kind of vision of the training being shared by all, so that clinical governance, suicide prevention, all the things that are so vitally important are shared in terms of training by voluntary and NHS. Yeah.
So all that's going to require funding.
Yeah.
How can we, I think we've touched on ring fencing. Yeah. How can we ensure that funding, whether it's through the public health grant or through what the NHS does, is ring fenced to tackle problem gambling?
Okay, well, until this morning, I had no anxieties about ring fencing. This is what we were promised. We worked hard to get the white paper. This has come through. We are delighted with the fact it's ring fenced. So I would like to alleviate your anxieties. I don't think there's any way it's not ring fenced.
The Gambling Act is clear that levy funding has to be used for purposes in connection with the licensing objectives in the Act.
When it moves down to the directors of public health in the local authorities, how can we be sure that they are going to be implementing measures to support problem gamblers using money from that?
I think it goes back to, sorry, I'm talking too much, I'll hand over, but I do think it's about accountability again, transparency and accountability, and that comes down to sums as well as outcomes.
Yeah, not much more to add.
Fear not, we've got questions for everyone. No, don't worry. This is your time.
It's just you were looking at me.
No, I'm looking at you all.
This is your time to talk to you.
From left to right, I suppose. But when you say accountability, who is going to be holding these people who will be commissioning services accountable, and who is going to be ensuring if they're going to be regular reporting on what happens at 150 odd local authorities across the country when it comes to public health interventions for gambling problems?
All right, so it depends what the money is being spent for. OHID will be in charge of overseeing the accountability for the delivery of services they've commissioned in prevention, and equally, the body that will become, I'm not going to, I can't tell you now exactly what it will look like, but the new incarnation of NHS England will for treatment. Now, research is highly relevant too, because we need to really understand how the different commissioners of different types of research, because it's not, there's genetics, there's neurobiology, there is randomized controlled trials, there's all sorts of stuff. And then how does that end up being overseen, and is UKRI going to oversee it all? That is one of the things that, we will be reassuring the nation.
Clarify that. Who's going to be taking I was very struck earlier by the fact that the Gamble-Aware was effectively vetoing or not allowing certain questions to be asked in research that was being undertaken. Who is going to be ensuring that the research is wholly independent? You have a bit of a tension in government between the industry representative in government and the health representative in government. So how much is the DCMS going to be involved in ensuring that or how much are we going to be involved in ensuring the DCMS ensures that the questions are neutral and the research is independent?
Research, I can guarantee 100% there is not going to be any industry influence on the £20 million a year overseen.
Do you see a tension in government between the DCMS as the representative of the industry, and which contributes a great deal to taxation, and the Department of Health and Social Care and Public Health, which are trying to stop problem gambling, help people with problem gambling? Is there a tension there when it comes to supporting research through, for example, the programme board and the advisory group?
In terms, now I will leave Tim to answer his bit because that's different, it's a separate pot. But in terms of the research that is independent, free from industry influence, in order for us to fully understand and allow researchers to deliver their message, there will not be any problems with any industry interference with that 20 million. But there is a different type of research happening too, which is Tim's
particularly to your question, as someone that's kind of worked closely with government on these issues for a number of years, that has just not been my experience. The reality is that I have found a tremendous amount of overlap between what DCMS, what Department of Health, the Home Office, what we're looking for. And it's worth remembering, although we are the statutory regulator and subject to the licensing objectives, the Secretary of State for Culture is also subject to those licensing objectives, which includes protecting children and vulnerable people from harm. So there is absolutely, I think, coming together of interest there. I think, clearly government has to be mindful of the totality of the public policy agenda, but I think it would be wrong to say that DCMS do not focus upon harm. That just has not been my experience as the regulator.
Thank you, that's very clear. Thank you. Alex McIntyre.
Great, thank you. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to direct these questions at Andrew, if I may. Andrew, we've heard from the previous panel about areas that are doing some good work, and also from Henrietta just now that there are areas that perhaps haven't got the resources that elsewhere has. So when OHID are pulling together a national strategy on prevention, how will OHID work with local public health professionals across the country in developing that national strategy?
It's a really good question, and it's essential that we understand all the good works out there. I think the first panel referred to the strategies in Yorkshire and Humber and the Greater Manchester metropolitan area, and I recognise those examples. So we will take every effort to engage widely with the third sector and local authorities. We're doing a few specific things in the department. We're undertaking now a stock take of all the activities that are out there. We have surveyed every organisation that we're aware of that is active in the prevention space, and all local authorities. We're synthesising the evidence from that stock take. We are also setting up our own governance, and we're setting up a task and finish group that will have external voices on it to help provide some external expertise into our thinking. But it's critical to your point that we don't sit apart from the system and take decisions. We understand what's out there, and we listen to everything that the system has to tell us about what is working, what isn't working. That's particularly the case because, as we heard in the first panel, the evidence base here is somewhat limited, and we need to leverage on what is already happening.
My colleague touched upon this earlier with some of the questions around some of the different inequalities around this in different local communities. Is that another work strand that you're looking at in terms of how we can tackle some of those and get into communities that are perhaps more difficult to reach with prevention programmes?
Yeah, I mean, look, that is a really complex area. We're at the start of this journey, having just been appointed Prevention Commissioner. So we're going to have to test and learn. I imagine that the spending decisions we make in year one will be different from year two, and so on. We need to learn how we can reach to those sorts of groups. We need to think as well as about population-wide interventions, how we target our approach, particularly for those people who are at risk because they live in deprived areas, but not just that, because they have existing mental health issues, because they're unemployed, because they're male, because they're relatively young. As the first panel said, there are many at-risk indicators which we'll need to think about as we work through a prevention approach.
And when can we expect to see a national strategy from OHID?
So we are working at pace to put in place our plans. I'm not able right now to commit to a specific date or specific spending decisions, but I recognise
a rough date at all in terms of a quarter or a year?
As quickly as possible in this financial year, because what we want to do is ensure as smooth and stable transition as possible between the voluntary system and the statutory system. Now, we were only publicly appointed in February, but we recognise the urgency, so I'm not going to commit to a specific date, but I want to reassure you that that is front of mind, that we need to work.
Sometime between now and the 5th of April 2026.
As soon as possible in this financial year.
And in terms of working with others, so obviously we talked about local public health professionals, but about working with the NHS and the Gambling Commission, how do you see the role of OHID working with them in terms of making sure that we embed this prevention-based approach in everything that we're doing?
Really good question. We, of course, need to work really closely together. I think my colleague made this point that we already have really good relationships, and those are now going to set to continue. DCMS are putting in place formal governance arrangements, but underneath that we're going to have to be in regular close contact throughout this period.
And I'm struck that you said obviously there's a lot of things we don't know in this space, and how will you be working to test kind of the effectiveness of the interventions, and have you got an idea already in terms of how you might evaluate the effectiveness and report back on that?
Yes. I mean, you're right that the evidence base is somewhat limited. We don't have a sort of pre-existing framework of interventions that we know works like other areas. So we're going to have to do a bit of learning as we go. I mean, we're going to have to look at effectiveness and impact in different ways, and we're going to have to work with our DCMS, NHS, Gambling Commission colleagues to take views on what is value for money, what is impactful, and to continue to have that sort of regular feedback loop with external experts. This is going to be difficult in the early stages, but as UKRI take forward their research programme, I'm hoping more and more of the evidence gaps will be filled.
Thank you. More questions?
Thank you very much. Joe Platt.
Thank you, Chair. So my questions are directed to you, Tim, with regards to the Commission. So the 2020 PAC report was pretty damning. I want to find out what the Commission has taken since that report to improve the data and the intelligence it uses to identify what's going wrong for consumers and you being able to intervene quickly. So are you still doing enough?
Yeah, so I think it's worth saying that every recommendation that was in that 2020 report has been completed, and NAO have confirmed that to be the case. Specifically around data, I suppose the biggest development was the launch last year of the Gambling Survey for Great Britain, which I touched upon earlier. So that is surveying around 20,000 people a year, so it makes it the biggest of its kind anywhere in the world. And it's already starting to give us a really comprehensive picture, not just of things like kind of headline rates of problem gambling and things like that, which are only a part of the picture. It allows us to drill down into much more detail, and we've started publishing some more in-depth reports falling from that. In a couple of months' time, we'll be publishing the next annual report from that. So it's now giving us, a much more detailed picture. And it's really important that we had that at the same time as delivering on the white paper commitments, because evaluating whether those regulatory changes are really delivering the benefits that we expect is going to be important, and so that data forms a really important part of that. Alongside that, I think the two other developments that I would highlight is we fully established a number of advisory panels within the Commission, including a lived experience advisory panel, so we can draw upon the experiences of people who have actually experienced gambling harm or their loved ones as well, alongside our other advisory panels. And we've also commissioned quite extensive programmes of research understanding consumer experiences. So, as I think we touched upon earlier, kind of people's journeys into gambling, people's journeys through gambling, to give us that much richer understanding.
Because I'm really interested in that bit, because obviously the report in 2020 stated that the Commission didn't know what impact they are having on problem gambling, or what measures would demonstrate that regulation is working. And then we heard from the previous panel, who all informed us that new updated studies are desperately needed. So, when will them new updated studies be met, so that we understand that a little bit more? Or is the same true now as it was back in 2020?
No, absolutely not. So, already you're seeing those studies coming out. You can go onto our website. There's a huge amount of research and data that we're publishing. We make it all available for people to see and challenge for themselves. I think in terms of some of the specific impacts that we've seen, some of the examples I would draw upon is that the sort of egregious breaches that we were seeing back then, often from some of the biggest operators, are just not coming through in our casework anymore. We are still seeing issues that we have to tackle, but those big kind of breaches that go way beyond what's acceptable are just not there. So we're seeing much better levels of compliance from the industry. We've done things like introducing, a ban on gambling on credit cards, and the evaluation of that has shown that we were able to implement that in a way that didn't drive people to other illegal forms of lending. So there's a whole range of measures that we put in place that are really having an impact for people in the real world.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up on that? I understand that you can't look at cases older than 2 years old. Is that right?
No, so that's not
right.
Correct. So there are some time limits in terms of when we bring particular kind of regulatory actions, so we have to have completed our work within that time period. But we can look further back. What we're conscious of, though, is that particularly over the last couple of years, there's been such a huge amount of regulatory change that actually the rules that exist now will often not be the same ones that were in place 2 years ago. And our focus is on ensuring that operators are compliant with our rules as they stand.
Sorry, this was a question
Forgive me,
from
I
Ben Tolman, just very
wrote
quickly.
recently on behalf of a constituent to the Gambling Commission, and the response said, and I quote from the letter from the Deputy Chief Executive, the Commission cannot consider historical complaints events that occurred more than 2 years ago. So there seems to be some dispute between what you're saying, what was said there, or perhaps
it depends upon the particular kind of facts. So if
it would have depended on the case.
That's not what the Deputy Chief Executive says. She says it cannot consider historical complaints, not contextualising it. Straightforward statement. Why would she make that statement when you're contextualising it?
It does depend upon what issue you've got there. So if, for example, something from a couple of years ago points to a potential existing breach of our rules, existing non-compliance, we can take that forward and look at, are they currently compliant? In most cases where we referred historic things, actually it is something that we've probably already looked at through a kind of wider review of licences.
If the company hasn't behaved properly, you cannot look back more than 2 years. Is that what you're saying?
No, if the regulatory action that we were going to take was in relation to those specific events and 2 years have passed, then there are going to be significant limitations on us being able to do that.
What limitations?
So the legislation actually imposes certain time limits on when we can take forward.
That's the answer we were looking for. Thank you. Do apply.
How can you encourage operators to go beyond the minimum required to prevent gambling-related harms? And do you have any examples of where that's happened?
Yeah, so I mean, a good example at the moment is the development of something which was originally called Single Customer View, is now called Gam Protect, which basically is a system where operators can share with each other where they've identified kind of a flag that a consumer might be experiencing severe levels of harm. And the idea is that in some cases, when an individual operator looks at a customer, they might be able to see the totality of the harm. But we know that most people that are scoring, for example, 8+ on the PGSI are gambling with multiple operators. Now, actually, that's something that at the moment, I think 7 operators have voluntarily come together to develop and build. We are now looking at kind of the evaluation of that, and actually if it's shown to be really effective, we will look at whether we mandate that within our rules. But there's a good example of, following pressure from us, operators voluntarily going beyond what the rules currently say and potentially helping to shape what we might require of other operators in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Sorry, I just wanted to add one from my own 20-year perspective of dealing with the industry and with gambling disorder. I don't think industry can self-regulate on any level because the interest financially is too great for them to do the right thing at every opportunity.
What makes you say that?
Just from the hundreds of people I've come across who have received all sorts of messages, who haven't been self-regulated. I had 2 people last week who kept on returning to the same bookmakers day after day despite self-exclusion. I mean, I won't bore you with all the details, but, I feel that. But the reason why I'm bringing it up now is that you did ask the past panel what would they like to see, major changes.
I'm going to come to that question for you, but please don't
I
preempt
hope
my
I'll
questions.
remember then, but it is linked to this, and it's about data sharing. Yeah.
Do you mind if I just respond very quickly? Because I think it's important to say that where things are done on a voluntary basis, I do not see that as being self-regulation. This is not an industry that is self-regulating. It's worth remembering, although we're the statutory regulator for Britain, every local authority in the country is a gambling regulator. The Secretary of State is a regulator of gambling. So I think it would be wrong to suggest this is a self-regulated industry, but there are absolutely opportunities where industry can go beyond those set standards.
Yeah, but Miller, I mean, we heard also in the last panel that yes, they are regulators, but the issue may well be the legislation. The issue is that this is moving so fast that the legislation is just not caught up. And, there were recommendations made by previous committees that, for example, loot boxes and others should be regulated, and maybe that's kept under review now. So my question, if I may, to all of you is, what more powers would you like? So let's imagine the King's Speech is coming, and in there will be a new gambling bill. This is a hypothetical, and I'd urge you to answer it. What would you like in that bill? You can have two things, and two things alone. And I'll start with Tim Miller.
So, helpfully, government's already committed to the two things that we want in the white paper. One was to have the powers for us to be able to require internet service providers to take down illegal websites, and that is now in the criminal justice bill that's going through Parliament at the moment. Mm-hmm. The other is to give us power to be able to set our own licensing fees so that we can flex our resources to meet those changing challenges. You know, I've highlighted the illegal market, for example. That is going to become more and more costly for us to address, and we need to have that freedom to be able to flex our licensing fees to meet those challenges.
Thank you. Professor Bowden-Jones.
I'll give you one because it's a little lengthy.
One good one's fine too.
Okay,
yeah.
so I feel strongly that if we are moving into a new era and industry's absolutely keen to collaborate because we've got this money, we are very transparent about how we're going to spend it, and everyone's working together, then the next phase for me needs to be, and I'm speaking on behalf of all the people who've lost their relatives from suicide to gambling, and all the families who've lost their family homes because of gambling debts. There has to be a way in which data, i.e. all the things the industry knows about each and every player, can be made available to
forcing open data on the gambling companies.
Yes, because that way we would be able to detect harm way before someone ends up losing their lives or losing their home, just by looking at data. Do they have the money? No, they don't. Where are they getting the money?
There's a power disparity here. So the companies have more data than the regulators.
The
and
only
government ever
people
does.
with data, the only people with data are the data that we're interested in, the data that drives people to end their lives. Only the industry has that data. It's too late once they've ended their lives, and even then we don't know who kills themselves because we haven't got access to knowing whether they were gambling or not. And the families often are estranged or have no contact. So I think the best thing this country could do is to move to an open data source that is anonymized so that you end up only requesting it if you feel that it's important for the harm of an individual. And I do believe that would make a big change.
Andrew?
I mean, look, fundamentally what we want to see on prevention is a switch from treatment to sort of upstream interventions to reduce the risk of harm occurring. Right now, the way we are delivering on that is through the levy, not through regulation, which is ultimately a matter for DCMS. My answer, which isn't a perfect answer, I accept to you, is that I want to see the levy come into effect. It's new, it's a step change, it could be a watershed moment, and look at the impacts of that before thinking about other regulation.
Okay, so on that note, my final question, again to you all. So we are in a new era, this is coming in, we are at the next election, so the end of this Parliament. What will be different? What will be better by that point that you know will happen? And what would be different, what would be better that you hope will happen? Andrew?
We should seize the opportunity through the levy to reduce gambling harm and to ensure that people who are gambling do so at lower risk levels.
That's the hope?
That means that we want to see people not spending too much time gambling and spending too much money. Through awareness raising and through the prevention strand of the levy, I would like to see that a measurable difference over the next few years on levels of gambling harm.
Is that a hope or a no? Because I'm trying to get a sense of levels here. I want to know what's the minimum that you think is going to happen as a result of where we are now, and then what's the potential for where we could get to if implemented very well. Perhaps if I phrase it differently in advance for the other two. Do you want to say anything more?
Yeah, I mean, look, the levy represents a step change insofar as we're putting things on a stable, transparent footing. Mm-hmm. So we will see an effect. How big an effect, I don't yet know, but I would like to see that as big as possible.
Thank you. Professor Bowden-Jones.
So the no for me is that we are now in a position to deliver evidence-based treatment, no postcode lottery, to everyone who needs it, with a focus on those groups that will need it more in order to break down the barriers to treatment for them. And so that feels like a no. The hope is that the research agenda is taken seriously, that all things that need to be researched are researched, not just a little bit of here, a little bit there, because that's interesting to some people. I really believe the neuroscience, the neurobiology, the genetics, the randomized controlled trials need to be clearly outlined in this agenda this year in order to invest properly in things that we have not done for evermore.
Thank you. Continue.
I think the no is that we will have completed the delivery of the biggest reform of gambling regulation since 2005. I can be certain that the Gambling Commission would have done everything that we were meant to do under the White Paper. I think the hope is that those changes, the introduction of levy and so on, will allow us to have the comprehensive evidence base we need to be able to properly demonstrate that those changes have had the beneficial impact for consumers that we all want them to have.
Thank you. And on that, I end the session. Order.